Hello and welcome to another episode of This Week in Global Development. I'm Raj Kumar, the President and Editor-in-Chief here at Devex, and you're listening to a special edition of our podcast that we're calling Climate Plus. I'm on the ground in Baku along with my colleagues Jesse Chase-Lubitz and Ayana Mercy to bring you behind-the-scenes coverage of the key issues and debates at this critical climate conference. You're going to get to listen in as we talk to some of the leaders that are shaping climate finance and its impact on health, food, and much more. If you're in Baku, we hope you'll reach out to us. Listen in as we talk to the leaders that are shaping this space and tell us what you'd like to hear.
Hi, I'm Jesse Chase-Lubitz, and I'm coming to you from COP29 in Baku, Azerbaijan. In this episode, I talk to leading voices in the adaptation finance debate. First, you'll hear from Kulthoum Omari-Motsumi, Special Advisor to the Africa Adaptation Initiative. Next, you'll hear from Verkooijen, CEO of the Global Center on Adaptation. Finally, you'll learn about the Pacific Islands priorities at COP29 with Tagaloa Cooper, Director of the Climate Change Resilience Program at the South Pacific Regional Environment Program, or SPREP. They explore why climate adaptation is underfunded. They talk about their hopes for COP29, and they discuss how financing can protect vulnerable communities. Let's start with Kulthoum. She spoke openly about the slow pace of financing for adaptation since the Africa Adaptation Initiative was launched back in 2015. Kulthoum calls on institutions like the Green Climate Fund, or GCF, to offer streamlined access to funds. We have lots of different bodies popping up all the time in these types of meetings. So obviously we have the Loss and Damage Fund, we have the Adaptation Fund. Do you think that...
The GCF,
we've got hundreds of them.
A lot.
Do you feel like the creation of these new funds or organizations, whatever, is that making it harder to get money into adaptation? Is it pulling away funding from that and going instead to loss and damage? Because some of these things have a lot of overlap, right? It can be hard to really understand what the difference is between adaptation and resilience and loss and damage. So has less attention been put on adaptation ever since loss and damage came up?
Yes and no. Yes, because we are beginning to see more of these extreme events that are linked to loss and damage. So even if you don't want to talk about loss and damage, it's staring at you in your face, and we're beginning to see a lot more of these events, droughts, a lot more extreme droughts, floods, and so on and so forth. So it's becoming more a reality, loss and damage, and these sort of events and extreme events. And so the push towards the establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund was necessary given all these developments. What that will mean in the landscape of climate finance, I think we still maintain that as Africa. We still maintain that we need to treat adaptation mitigation in a balanced manner, but significantly increase financing for loss and damage. Why I'm saying that? Because loss and damage is completely different. There will be a completely different modality for loss and damage, right? So loss and damage will have financing has to be fast. I mean, when you have a flood, you can't wait for a process to get accredited and all of that processes that then will allow you to get the funding from a particular institution, which, as we know, it can take up to 3 years, right, to get the funds. By then, people are dead. You know, there's quite significant impacts happening on the ground. So the modality within which loss and damage financing will have to be accessed, will have to be completely reformed or completely different from what we have currently. So I think that's a conversation to be had. I don't think that the current institutions that are funding adaptation are set up in that manner. So I'm not, they're you know, if you take the GCF, for example, the accreditation process for us African countries to even be able to access funds from the GCF takes years, you know, and I mean it's designed that way. It's designed, of course, to increase access to developing countries, but all those requirements make it really cumbersome for particularly poorer countries or countries that don't have the capacities to be able to access or to develop proposals and so on and so forth. So it's very difficult and challenging to get financing from the GCF. But compare that to loss and damage, things have to change. Obviously, you have to access the funds very quickly.
I just want to go back to the basics a little bit of what adaptation really means. I know that it can be anything from education to drought-resistant crops to massive infrastructure projects that involve, moving land around, essentially. My first question is, which of these are you working on personally? What do you actually see going on mainly? What does adaptation mean in your experience?
So adaptation for us means the way we have been, the way we've been doing development, the way we've been doing things, the way we've been, we need to do that differently. We need to adjust because climate change is here. We cannot say do water supply in the same manner that we did because climate change will impact your water. We'll get less water, for example, water scarcity. Do we need to do water reuse, water recycling, and so on and so forth? Because we know that in 5-10 years' time, the water that we are expecting from surface water is going to decrease, say, by 30%, right? You have to now adjust how you distribute your water or how you manage your water at the national level so that you don't disrupt water supply, potable water supply systems, but you put in measures in place so that you still are able to deliver water to your people despite the impacts of climate change. That to me is that adjustment of doing things so that you're able to cater or integrate climate into the way you do planning is in my view adaptation. And adaptation cuts across all sectors. From not just food, like he talks about drought-resistant crops, but it's water, like I said, it's health. We're beginning to see that more sectors that are sort of your non-traditional climate-sensitive sectors being brought into this discussion. For example, we're actually seeing increased rate of mortality, right? As a result of heat strokes, as a result of vector-borne diseases, as a result of all of these, because these are all climate sensitive sort of health-related issues. So we're actually even bringing those non-traditional sectors into this discussion of adaptation because it cuts across everything. And even within the global goal on adaptation, we are also even talking about cultural heritage. So for example, many parts of Africa, they've got these heritage sites, even for example, the Zambezi water, for example, which is a beautiful water source or water body that attracts lots of animals and so on and so forth. They're beginning to shrink, and it's impacting downstream even tourism and so on and so forth. So even cultural heritage sites and so on. So it's impacting that. So adaptation is what measures we put in place in order to ensure that those impacts are minimized.
Okay. Do you feel like there is the potential for adaptation to go wrong? And I'm specifically talking about the big infrastructure types of adaptations. So land reclamation, for example, when you dig up sand from the ocean floor, put it, to make a new island or add land to an existing island, that's a mechanism. I mean, I think they're doing that in Lagos and Dakar and a ton of Pacific islands. But we don't really know what the impact of moving land around is going to be in 30 years' time. And there are other examples like that. This is such an unprecedented time that, our reaction could create other consequences. Is this something you're thinking about?
I mean, I'm also a scientist and an IPCC author in AR6, the sixth assessment report of the IPCC. I contributed to that. So that's a very useful, it's a good question in the sense that we need to think about these. What is the impact of some of these adaptation sort of action that we do? And even in the long term, what is the impact of that? I know there is the word maladaptation that many people have been able to use, and that is correct. It is possible, and we do, from my perspective, I think the framing or the lens that I like to use is looking at these three sort of pillars of sustainable development. So we look at the environmental aspects, we look at the social aspects, and the economic aspects, because I think once it's a very crude way of looking at it, but I think it's something that helps when you are thinking about some of the interventions or adaptation options that one may implement or may consider. Because the example that you gave, one needs to consider what is the social impact of this initiative or this adaptation option. What is the environmental impact? So not just considering one and leaving out the others. I particularly like the social aspect. How are people going to be impacted in not just now, but 10 years, 20 years, 30 years from now? How is the entire ecosystem going to be impacted because of these kinds of activities that we are doing, not just now, 10, 20 years from now? So I like to think of at least having that lens when we analyze adaptation options, and we tend to see that there are some adaptation options that are maladaptive, and they do exist. But we hope that through this process, through the Global Goal on Adaptation process, we can begin to sort of work with, or at least support countries in ensuring that these adaptation options are they build resilience, they build of communities, they build resilience of ecosystems, and they build resilience of our economies.
Are you interested in the intersection of business and social impact? Do you want to know how corporate sustainability, ESG, impact investing, and more can contribute to development finance? My name is Adva Saldinger. I'm a senior reporter at Devex, and I've been reporting on these issues for nearly a decade. I'm the author of Devex Invested, our free weekly newsletter dedicated to development finance. Every Tuesday, we explore how companies, investors, and market mechanisms are reshaping the world of development finance. Visit devex.com/newsletters and join us on Tuesdays.
I also sat down with Patrick Verkooijen to get his perspective on the global financing landscape for adaptation. Patrick stressed the urgency of increasing adaptation finance and raised concerns about maintaining climate commitments with the changing global political dynamics, especially the recent election of President Donald Trump in the United States. His call to action for COP29 was clear. We need to reimagine the Paris Agreement's focus on resilient economies as climate impacts accelerate worldwide. Let's just start with your job. What do you focus on? What do you do every day? And what do you care about here in Baku?
So what we do as a global center on adaptation is to make the case, but particularly not from an environmental perspective per se, or from a moral perspective per se, but mainly from the economic side of things. If you invest in this, your return on adaptation is much higher than if you don't invest in this. So we work in agriculture, we work in infrastructure, obviously in energy systems, and our niche is, so we provide the analytics for that, so our niche is just to connect these local solutions with financing from the international finance institutions. If you work at the World Bank and you develop, say, a large transport project in, say, Senegal, we work then with the World Bank team and the Senegalese government to make sure that that transport project is resilient, i.e. will not be washed away by the next flood. So it's a very practical agenda. So back to your opening question, why am I here in Baku? Obviously, the key agenda item at this particular climate summit is about financing. I mean, the international community is now negotiating on this new collective quantifiable goal. So the goal of financing from rich countries to basically poor countries, and it should be much more than what was committed to in 2009, which was obviously $100 billion a year. So is it $500 billion? Is it $1 trillion? And then who will pay? My preoccupation, or perhaps even me more self-critical, my obsession is how much money of the new goal will be spent on adaptation and how much money will be coming through in the coming years. Final point, 2021. If we were to have this conversation 3 years ago and we were sitting at a similar climate summit setup, 3 years ago, the international community agreed in Glasgow to double adaptation finance from rich countries to the global south, from $20 billion a year to $40 billion a year. And where are we today? We're far off that doubling. So I have sort of a mixed perspective of what we're doing here today. On the one hand, we're negotiating the new climate finance commitment, but I fear that we also may lose focus on the original commitment, right? There's sort of a tendency in the international community to have one goal, another aspiration, followed by another aspiration. I think it's far more effective. First deliver what you promised before, and then scale from that.
When you talk about adaptation and what the point is, it seems very obvious. Why wouldn't we put money into this? And yet it is perennially underfunded, right? We have a $187 to $359 billion gap right now, annually. Why is it so difficult to get money to adaptation?
Well, first and foremost, if you just look at the climate finance envelope, the money which is flowing today, it's indeed 95%, which goes to mitigation, right? Reducing a carbon footprint. Why is that easier to invest in? Because it is easier to measure. It's a ton of carbon being reduced. So it's very tangible what you do. With adaptation, it's much less sort of defined on what adaptation finance exactly is. Because adaptation, at the end of the day, is about development. It is about a young mother in Bangladesh who flees the southern part of the country with an incoming cyclone because of the early warning system which is being in place. It is about the drought-tolerant seeds being used by smallholder farmer. It is about building our infrastructure differently. So it is development, but through a human-centered lens. And so the co-benefits of adaptation in development is very clear, but how to measure that, I think that is slightly more difficult. That's one thing. The second piece, which makes it slightly more complicated to invest in, is the return on investment for business, right? If you invest in, say, energy efficiency, basically your energy bill at the end of the day will be less at the end of the month, and you as a consumer know exactly what where your benefits are. In case of adaptation benefits, the dike which is being built obviously has as clear economic and security benefits, but the financial return on that particular investment is much less clear. That is why it's very important that governments across the globe invest in adaptation, because basically it is about securing the well-being of their societies in which they would like to thrive. So it is a complex agenda. But for me, it's at the same time, it's complex and super simple. It's about development. It's about smart development and hence resilient development. And the good thing is we see lots of examples across the globe where local communities are investing in adaptation. Let me give you an example. Very recently, I was in Mongla. Mongla is a secondary city in Bangladesh, right? So the Bangladesh government has this objective to reduce migration from secondary cities to Dhaka, right? And that secondary city migration to Dhaka is largely driven by climatic events, right? When the cyclones come in, where the floods come, people leave these areas and come to Dhaka. To reduce the pressure on Dhaka as a mega city, what now the idea is to invest in climate adaptation in these secondary cities. So what happens in Mongla, we have a program together with the Asian Development Bank and the World Bank where we sit with local communities and we ask them a very simple question. What are the adaptation priorities which you have? Meaning, what are your needs in terms of water, sanitation, infrastructure? They know really well, if you live in a sort of informal settlement in Mongla, you know exactly what the climatic impact, because you're living it. So what we're developing with these local communities are so-called people's adaptation plans. So it's a bottom-up economic transformation where they come forward and say, okay, my priorities are 1, 2, 3, 4. But it is no use, obviously, to have a people's adaptation plan if it's not funded, right? So our role as Global Center on Adaptation is, in essence, we're a transmission belt, right? You have a people's adaptation plan, and we link that up with large-scale financing from, in this instance, the Asian Development Bank or the World Bank, so that they invest in these local communities, but based on their priorities. I think that these are very exciting sort of examples. But what they need scale. They need to be replicated across the country, across the continent, in fact, across the world. And they need speed. We are running out of time. The climate impacts are spinning out of control. So basically, I feel at times, even now here in Baku, that we're sitting in this race car, which is basically doesn't have any brakes. We forgot to put our seat belts on and we don't have the guardrails in place. Is that a smart way of driving? Probably not. Equivalently, is that a smart way to run our economies? Probably not. So my sense is what we need to do in Baku or at these climate events is to rephrase basically and reimagine the Paris Agreement. It should be much less focus on the argument of pollution control, important as it is, but it should be much more about resilient economies. I think in this day and age, particularly against this sort of geo-economic reality, I think the adaptation agenda, given that we're way off track on the mitigation side, given that the impacts are already being felt across the globe, we now have to massively double down on adaptation. And I think in Baku, we need to send that signal that we're ready to do so.
So you mentioned, as far as this COP goes, you mentioned the NCQG, you're keeping an eye on that. Is there anything else you're looking at closely in the negotiations? Specifically, the adaptation fund, is that something that you're watching?
Yes, so as I said, where I'm particularly focused on is about this large goal for climate finance in sort of for the future, and the delivery of the previous goal on adaptation finance from 2021, the doubling. And the third piece, which is front and center, which we haven't discussed yet, is basically the big elephant in the room here in Baku, is the Trump administration, right? The incoming Trump administration, and then the question is, what will be the implication of a potential pullout of the U.S. from the Paris Accord, perhaps even the whole climate convention? My take is this: whether you are from a blue state or a red state, the climate impacts are really there already. I think climate resilience is being felt by Main Street American citizens, and it is also being felt by Wall Street, given the financial implications they're already experiencing. But if we should reframe the debate again, my working assumption is that under a Trump administration, speaking of climate adaptation may not necessarily lead to productive outcome in collaboration with the United States federal government, but speaking about resilient economies, speaking about jobs, speaking about growth, might be a different way of framing which leads to productive outcomes. And that is my at least conviction where we should go from Baku going forward. We cannot give up on adaptation. In fact, given we're so far off track on lowering our carbon footprint, there's no other way to go than invest and double down on that.
Tagaloa Cooper traveled to COP29 from Samoa, where she serves as director of the Climate Change Resilience Program at the South Pacific Regional Environment Program, or SPREP. She offered powerful insights into the urgent need for increased adaptation funding for Pacific Island nations. In particular, she emphasized the vital role of nature-based solutions, called for a shift from traditional aid to grant-based support, and highlighted the importance of more coordination and commitment from donors. This COP is really important. Every COP is really important to Pacific Island nations. You're really at the front lines of climate change. What are you seeing as kind of the most pressing issues for island nations in adaptation today?
In adaptation, I'll start first with your comment on this COP and every COP being important for the Pacific because we're on the front lines. I don't think the global north realize what the front line looks like, what the impacts look like. And yesterday, President Hilda Heine from the Marshall Islands, in her statement, did reference that nobody's immune. So what the front line looks like for us now, that maybe a lot of people in the global north don't realize or don't see to understand, is the reason why we have a pavilion here, so that Pacific people can tell their stories about living on the front line, about living with the impacts of climate change, and of course adaptation is important to us. So I want to say loss and damage is important to the Pacific as well, but adaptation right now is critical, because as you know, there will come a point where we can't adapt anymore. So we are pleased that there is the Loss and Damage Fund that can address needs in loss and damage that are already happening in the Pacific. But for us, the investment it's critical that the right investment is made in adaptation now, because now and before now, leading up to the now, adaptation needs have been, underfunded for the Pacific. And so when you talk about the 100 billion ceiling, we really shouldn't be talking about 100 billion anymore. We should be talking about trillions of dollars in support. And look at what happened when COVID happened. The world mobilized and came up with trillions of dollars to address COVID-19, and climate change is not urgent enough. That baffles me. But I know as a person living on the front line, it's not something that a lot of people and a lot of developed countries can see and touch. Like COVID-19, they could see with their eyes the impacts in their own countries. But this is like a problem that's so far away. But we're here, our countries are here to say the problem is here, and it's now, and it's not going away, and it's not going to go away until there is global commitment to increase funding, simplified access, to ensure that money flows, finance flows, so that small island states can benefit from it.
Loss and damage is great, but right now we need adaptation funding. What do you see as the window for that?
First of all, there has to be conclusion, an ambitious conclusion to the new collective quantified goal. It has to be enough funding. The operationalization of it needs to be real and simplified, right? And so that needs to happen now. There needs to be global agreement that, one, it's important, and two, that we are going to commit to a much higher threshold of funding.
But do you see that? Do we have a period of time, a number of years, before adaptation is no longer possible?
In some cases, adaptation is no longer possible now. For some of our species, and species, biodiversity, marine species that we've lost, that our countries depend on for food sources, against also their traditional knowledge and practices. For some of the adaptation of those elements, we've lost that opportunity. It depends on how you view what is adaptation.
What about for Pacific Island nations? I know they're all different. For some, has the window already closed?
For most.
For most, okay.
But it's the context and the question, yeah?
Okay.
We can't, I'm not here to say the window's closed for adaptation. No, it's not. We need funding for adaptation now. What I'm saying is, for some things that we have lost,
Okay.
we have lost the opportunity to adapt. For some species that we have lost due to climate change, we have lost the opportunity to allow those species to adapt because we have missed funding windows. Yeah? What we have now is an opportunity for funding, an opportunity still for adaptation, to address adaptation. And I can tell you, every country in the Pacific has adaptation priorities. We're working with 6 countries right now who are developing their national adaptation plans.
Yeah.
So when they are done with those national adaptation plans, that will be a collective, with a collection of priorities that chart a way forward for each of those countries that will require finance. Mm-hmm. What we don't want, those adaptation plans or any of the priorities of the Pacific countries in adaptation, is for those to have gone through 2 to 3 years of developing full consultation in country to develop those priorities agreed to at the highest level, and then sit on a shelf because there's no money there is, and the cupboard is bare to implement those priorities. And that's why the NDCs are so important as well, because those show the priorities of countries moving, regularly and being updated. So, but for the Pacific, we have the multilateral funds, the GCF and the Adaptation Fund. But you will hear Pacific countries talk about how difficult they are to access.
Yeah.
And then the irony is they were set up for developing countries. But the processes involved are so bureaucratic and so cumbersome that most of the smaller countries where people wear 5 hats don't have the spare capacity to be dedicated to developing project proposals to reach a bankable stage. And that's where our countries also need the help of our organizations to assist and fill that gap. The gap that remains is finance. The challenge we still face is accessing that finance so it can, in real terms, flow into countries so that they can implement their work. The Pacific haven't come here to talk about adaptation needs without knowing what they're talking about. They've got their plans, they've got their priorities, they know what they need. And some of them have started developing project proposals only to come up against a wall where you need funding to develop those projects, the next steps, and even in the first stages. So you can get from the GCF project preparation funds, but to get to that point there needs to be an investment first. And small line developing states don't have that luxury.
Right. Going back to the finance gap a bit between mitigation and adaptation, Pacific Island countries still get mitigation funding, right? How is that used in comparison? I mean, adaptation covers a lot of different things, right? So what's the use of mitigation?
Some of our countries have, actually most of our countries have invested in renewable energy, clean energy to support the national grid.
Okay.
So that's happening in most countries, and in the Pacific, and a lot of our countries also are looking at clean energy, clean transportation. Yeah. There's one of our countries who's developed a project proposal for cleaner shipping.
Okay.
Between islands. Yeah. So mitigation is important to the Pacific.
Okay.
But it has to happen hand in hand.
Thanks for listening to this special episode of This Week in Global Development. If you enjoyed this episode, please share it, or you can leave us a rating or a review. We'd also love to hear from you. If you have any feedback or want to get in touch, you can find me on social media at Raj_Devex, or send an email to podcast@devex.com. Be sure to sign up for our daily newswire for more of our must-read insider coverage of all things global development.